What happens when the thing you built with blood and years you're one piece of undeniable proof you made it becomes the collateral for someone else's fairy tale wedding? We are about to witness the slow, meticulous dismantling of a man's future, piece by agonizing piece, all for the sake of a white dress and a grand ballroom. It wasn't just metal and horsepower. It was 5 years of double shifts, stale coffee, and skipped vacations molded into sleek obsidian black. That car, the meticulously restored 1970 Charger, was Michael's silent, beautiful protest against poverty, his victory lap. The scent of gasoline and polished leather was the smell of achieved freedom. But freedom, apparently, is negotiable when family calls. Then came Amelia. His younger sister had always lived in a different financial orbit, one without limits. Her wedding wasn't just a ceremony. It was an economic declaration. The invitations demanded imported silk. The venue required a staggering 6-figure down payment. Each demand landed on Michael's shoulders like a physical weight. He watched the numbers churn, and for the first time since he bought the Charger, the soft leather interior wasn't comforting. It felt like a ticking clock. The pressure wasn't just financial, it was existential. Was his hard-earned success truly worthless compared to Amelia's social obligation? Michael walked into the communal garage, already mentally listing the parts he needed for the next upgrade. The smell of oil and stale exhaust usually calmed him. Today, it tasted like dust. He rounded the corner, his gaze fixed on the familiar spot. B14, his feet stopped dead. B214 was empty. Not temporarily empty, stripped bare. No oil stains, no tire marks, just clean, cold concrete reflecting the fluorescent tubes above. The space mocked him. It wasn't stolen. It was professionally removed. Panic, slick, and cold replaced the initial confusion. Thieves don't clean up. He ran his hand over the adjacent pillar, searching for a note, a scratch, anything. He checked his phone, half expecting an impound notice, but there was nothing. The keys were still in his pocket, the heavy, solid antique key he only used for ignition. How could they move it? He rushed back upstairs, tearing through the apartment for the title papers, realizing instantly they were also gone from the lockbox beneath the floorboard. They didn't just take the car, they took the proof he owned it. He found a small, folded envelope taped crudely to his kitchen counter. It wasn't from Amelia. It was his mother's handwriting, neat and terrifyingly devoid of emotion. He ripped it open. The note was brief, a clinical 3-sentence. We needed $75,000 for the final venue payment. We used the spare set. The buyer insisted on immediate collection. 75. The number was a gunshot. He stared at the signature, a single, looping mom, feeling the blood drain from his face. The spare key was always kept at his parents' house, a detail he had foolishly forgotten. Michael didn't call. Calling meant delay, meant negotiation, meant them trying to placate him with soft voices. He needed impact. He grabbed his coat, the sound of his own heavy breathing, the only noise in the apartment. Driving there wasn't an option, obviously. The cab ride was a blur of frantic traffic lights and distorted street signs. He was rehearsing the scene in his head, the righteous fury, the demands for Anne. But what answer could justify this surgical removal of his future? The deficit wasn't sudden. The note was dated 3 days ago, meaning they let him live with the illusion while the deal was already done. He burst through the front door of his childhood home without knocking, the force shaking the framed pictures on the hallway table. His mother, Eleanor, was sitting at the diningtable.com sipping tea, reviewing seating charts covered in glitter pen. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that instantly ignited his rage. Where's it? Where's it? Where's it? He didn't use her name often. She looked up, slow and deliberate, setting the cup down with a delicate, audible click. She wasn't surprised. She had been waiting for this confrontation. Michael, please don't shout. Amelia's caterer meeting is in an hour. Her voice was measured, a knife wrapped in velvet. It's handled. We covered the gap. It was always the easiest solution, considering your lack of engagement. He felt a searing heat behind his eyes. My lack of engagement? That car was 5 years of my life. My blood, my sweat, my ticket out of this damn neighborhood. Where was his father? The kitchen was silent, the silence amplifying the betrayal. The buyer was an acquaintance of the father, a collector known for discreet cash transactions. It was just a vehicle. Michael, Amelia needs stability. A respectable wedding ensures that. Your ticket out was a selfish hobby, Eleanor stated, folding a place card with unnerving precision. Besides, the buyer gave us a generous price, almost full market value. You weren't using it optimally. He stood over her, his hands balled into fists, fighting the urge to shatter the delicate china around them. He could hear his father, Robert, moving upstairs, clearly avoiding the blast zone. The generous price was actually $20,000 below market value, a desperate, quick sell. Robert, get down here, Michael roared, the sound echoing through the house. After a drawn-out moment of tension, his father descended, looking like a ghost in his own home, eyes fixed on the staircase carpet. He wouldn't meet Michael's gaze. Son, Robert mumbled, the word tasting like ash. It was the only way to avoid absolute humiliation for your sister. The bank was threatening foreclosure on the venue bond. Robert had signed the sales papers using his power of attorney, a legal loophole Michael had granted years ago for emergency medical decisions. Humiliation? And what about mine? You traded my freedom for a centerpiece. Did Amelia even know? Did she authorize the sale of my only asset? Mikhail demanded, his voice cracking with the sheer weight of disbelief. Eleanor scoffed. Amelia is under enough stress. She doesn't need to worry about mechanical cars. But yes, she knew the general solution, and she was relieved. That was the sharpest cut. The sister he'd protected, the one whose life he'd subsidized in small ways, had signed off on his distress. Amelia had actually suggested the car sale first, viewing it as untapped capital. The ensuing silence wasn't a pause. It was a fractal line running through the foundation of their relationship. Michael looked from his rigid, unapologetic mother to his defeated, cowardly father. The car wasn't just metal. It was proof that he mattered, that his labor had value separate from their needs. They had confirmed what he always suspected in his family. He was a resource to be exploited, not a person to be cherished. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the antique ignition key. He threw the key down onto the polished wood floor, the sound surprisingly heavy, a symbolic severing. Keep the money, Michael said, his voice now dangerously calm. Stripped of fury. Use it to buy more imported silk. Use it to pay for whatever unsustainable future Amelia is demanding. He looked directly at his father, a gaze utterly devoid of warmth. You didn't just sell a car. You sold your son. You sold the history we had. Eleanor started to speak, a protest forming on her lips, but Michael cut her off, raising a hand that trembled only slightly. Michael didn't ask for the money back. He viewed the loss as a final payment on the debt of his childhood. This is the final transaction. You will never ask me for anything again. You won't know where I move, and you won't be invited to anything I achieve. The debt is paid, but the resentment, that's mine now, and I'm going to use every drop of it. He turned toward the door. As he walked out, he heard his mother whisper, "Don't be dramatic, Michael." That casual dismissal solidified the break. He walked back into the city air, lighter, though hollowed out. Before leaving the property line, Michael took out his phone and blocked both their numbers, ensuring the finality. The charger was gone, but the engine of his fury was just starting to rev. He didn't look back at the house bathed in the afternoon sun. He didn't look back at the life they had tried to chain him to. He was alone, financially devastated, and burning with a rage that finally felt clean. That day, Michael didn't lose his car. He gained a focus so sharp it felt like a weapon aimed squarely at a future they could never touch. He would rebuild the car, brick by painstaking brick, if only to ensure they saw exactly what they threw away. Michael left the property line, but he never truly left the moment of the break. The rage was an acid bath, cleansing everything except the ambition it created. He didn't look for easy jobs or quick fixes. He found a miserable, windowless office space above a loud bar downtown, cheap enough that the rent didn't sting. Sleep became a myth, and his diet consisted mainly of caffeinated drinks and stale pastries. The first year was purely survival, a blur of coding and phone calls where his voice was hoarse and his resolve unbreakable. He knew exactly how much cash he needed to rebuild the Charger, but that number was now obsolete. The actual goal was an amount they couldn't even comprehend, a fortress built of indifference. The initial project was a complex logistical software soluandry, demanding and high margin. He took the contract under a newly formed LLC, intentionally opaque, burying his involvement 3 layers deep. He used the alias M. Kane on correspondence, a nod to the fact that he was metaphorically killing his past. The work was his penance and his prayer. He worked 17 hours a day, sustained by the sheer memory of his mother's casual dismissal. He stopped tracking days, tracking only deliverables and bank balances. Success wasn't measured in milestones. It was measured in the growing distance between himself and that suburban house. He had to hire someone eventually, but he insisted they never meet him in person, relying entirely on encrypted chat channels. The first contract blew up, not literally, but the profits were exponential. Michael reinvested every cent, immediately scaling the infrastructure. He moved out of the wretched office space, but not into comfort. He rented a bare, modern condo far across the seedy high-up, sterile and entirely functional. No decorations, no personal touches. It was a bunker. His only luxury was triple monitors and a very fast internet connection. He cut off every remaining social tie that might lead back to his former life. He learned to listen to the silence, letting the city hum become his white noise. He found himself avoiding mirrors, not wanting to see the ghost of the boy who drove the Charger. He started depositing the money into offshore accounts structured so complexly that even he sometimes had to triple-check the ownership flowchart. Years passed, 2 became 4. The financial success was undeniable, a humming presence in the background, a silent army protecting him. He had inadvertently stumbled onto a niche market where his intensity was a strategic advantage. He didn't negotiate, he dictated terms. He didn't seek clients. Clients begged for his services, unaware they were dealing with a ghost. The silence became paramount. He changed his email addresses quarterly, updated security protocols weekly, and paid specialized consultants hefty sums just to ensure his digital footprint remained invisible to 2 specific phone numbers he still kept memorized. He knew they had tried to contact him multiple times in the first year, but their attempts ceased abruptly after a strange incident involving a public records. The work took its toll. His shoulders were perpetually tight, and he rarely saw natural light. He looked older than his age, sharp around the edges, like a sculpture carved quickly from granite, but he was undeniably efficient. He hired executive assistants, project managers, and even legal counsel, all managed remotely. All believe in him. Kane was a shadowy figure based somewhere in Europe or Asia. He maintained a bare-bones local existence, paying for everything with cash or untraceable digital currency. He needed anonymity, not for illegal reasons, but purely for protection. He realized the freedom he craved wasn't just financial, it was the freedom from expectation, from their judgment, from their existence. He occasionally drove past their old neighborhood late at night, a dangerous habit, always slowing down just enough to confirm the lights were off, ensuring nothing had changed in their predictable, suffocating world. The shift in motivation was subtle but profound. He wasn't working asterisk to prove asterisk he was worth something anymore. He was working asterisk to ensure asterisk he could never be touched by their need or their manipulation again. The money had become abstract, a defense mechanism. He saw the world in layers of vulnerability, and his goal was to be in the layer that was bomb-proof. He owned assets in multiple continents, had a liquid capital that dwarfed his former debt hundreds of times over, and yet he still ate microwave dinners in the sterile condo. He hadn't bought a new car. The Charger remained a silent monument to his rage, a promise unfulfilled only because the scope of the promise had grown too large. He started using a private investigator not to track them, but to ensure they weren't trying to track him, a paranoia that felt entirely justified. He was a ghost in his own success story. People talked about M. Cain in tech circles, speculating wildly about the source of his capital and his sudden rise. He read the articles sometimes, smiling thinly at the inaccurate theories. No one ever guessed the truth, that this titan was a college dropout fueled by petty inherited resentment and stale coffee. He kept the original plans for the Charger, the specific make and model of the engine he wanted tucked away in a physical safe. One of the few non-digital items he owned, it was a talisman. He hadn't touched the actual rebuild because doing so felt like closure, and closure was antithetical to the energy he needed to keep grinding. One of his remote assistants, a sharp woman named Elena, started asking slightly to probing questions about M. Cain's location, forcing Michael to implement a swift professional severance. Michael began to test the limits of his new power. He anonymously funded a rival company of his father's old associate, watching the inevitable chaos unfold from afar. He didn't do it for profit. He did it to understand the mechanics of leverage, the ease with which one could dismantle someone else's carefully constructed life using only digital currency and precise timing. It was a terrifying realization. He was now capable of inflicting the financial pain that had driven him to ruin years ago, only exponentially worse. Yet, he held back from using it against his parents. That wasn't independence. That was merely revenge, and revenge required interaction. He discovered a loophole in the complex financial structuring that allowed him to indirectly buy the very piece of land adjacent to their house, ensuring he controlled who his parents' future neighbors would be. Success was supposed to feel liberating, but Michael found it isolating. He was constantly running mental simulations, calculating threats and vulnerabilities. The absolute independence he sought required absolute vigilance. He felt like a sovereign entity, wealthy and powerful, yet completely alone in his vast, sterile kingdom. He sometimes thought about calling them just to hear their reaction to the news of his net worth to shove the scale of his achievement in their faces. But the memory of his mother's voice, don't be dramatic, always intervened. Dramatics required engagement. He preferred the silent, lethal drama of the market. He caught himself typing his mother's maiden name into a deep web search engine one night, looking not for information, but for any vulnerability he could exploit purely to satisfy a fleeting, morbid curiosity about the extent of their fragility. He began planning the next phase, moving beyond simple software logistics into decentralized finance and AI automation. This wasn't about more money, the money was already enough. This was about creating a legacy so vast and so shielded that even history would struggle to find the real Michael behind the moniker M. Cain. He designed his systems to run without him, aiming for total operational autonomy. The ultimate goal wasn't retirement, but disappearance. to reach a point where he could simply vanish, leaving behind a self-sustaining empire that generated wealth without needing his input. He realized his entire life had become a test. If they could never find him, had they ever truly mattered at all? The rage hadn't lessened, but it had matured. It was no longer a fire. It was the geothermal power source heating his vast, hidden financial engine. He still felt the hollowness from that day, the clean, sharp pain of betrayal. He allowed himself one moment of physical indulgence, a massive, soundproof storage unit in an undisclosed location, paid for 5 years in advance with cash. Inside, he kept only one item, a pristine, brand new V8 engine block, the precise model that had been in his Charger. It was disassembled, gleaming, waiting. He sometimes went to the unit late at night, not to assemble it, but just to stand near it, running his hands over the cold metal, whispering quiet promises to the phantom car. Michael understood now that absolute independence wasn't a destination. It was a state of permanent warfare against interaction. He was ready to scale his operations globally, moving into territory where national laws blurred and personal identity vanished. He checked his current net worth, a number that could buy his old house 1,000 times over, and felt nothing but the slight tremor of his own readiness. He closed the spreadsheet. He still hadn't bought a piece of furniture for the condo, relying on camping gear and takeout. The life he lived was Spartan, but the kingdom he ruled was limitless. He took a deep breath of the air-conditioned, recycled air, picked up his encrypted phone, and prepared to send the instructions for the final, irreversible acquisition. He was about to purchase a controlling interest in the debt portfolio of a mid-sized regional bank, and he knew with chilling certainty that this move would inevitably lead him back to the people who had created him. The acquisition of the regional bank's debt portfolio was less a negotiation and more a quiet surgical amputation. Michael didn't bother with corporate fanfare. He simply applied pressure points until the institution yielded its control. The financial maneuver was complete within 48 hours, causing barely a ripple in the major market, yet shifting billions into his sphere of influence. This final, colossal step meant the nomadic life was no longer tenable. Power demands inertia, and inertia requires ground to stand on. This Spartan condo, adequate for a general preparing for war, felt laughably small for a ruler who had just annexed a major territory. He needed permanence. He needed space that breathed the same air as his ambition. He liquidated the anonymous condo, but kept one single item, sealed container the size of a suitcase whose contents were known only to his most trusted encryption specialist. The property search was handled by a shell corporation operating 3 layers deep within Panamanian Trust. Location was paramount, remote, defensible, yet easily accessible by private air transport. They found it nestled in the sprawling, rugged high desert of Nevada, 40 square miles of unforgiving, bounded by federal restriction zones and accessible only via a private, unmarked road. The land deal itself was complex, involving extinguishing old mining claims and navigating esoteric water rights, but money, when applied with enough force, bends bureaucracy into compliant shapes. Michael barely glanced at the topographical maps, focusing only on the schematics of the planned structures. The previous owner, a reclusive tech mogul, had vanished years earlier, leaving behind rumors of an underground bunker system far more extensive than the purchase documents disclosed. This sprawling domain was not primarily meant for living. It was designed for storage, specifically for the collection, the childhood memory of the sold vehicle, the cherished muscle car he watched disappear down the street had festered not as regret, but as a blueprint for dominance. He couldn't get that asterisk car back, Not exactly, but he could build a pantheon so magnificent, so complete, that the memory of its loss would finally be overwhelmed by sheer, overwhelming material triumph. This wasn't hobbyist collecting. This was systemic, highly focused curation designed to rewrite history. The security systems around the planned garages were designed by a former NATO intelligence officer who had one specific, unusual requirement. The ventilation system must be capable of purifying the air down to medical-grade sterility. The construction began immediately, far from the main house footprint. It was less a garage and more an automotive cathedral. 3 separate subterranean levels carved into the bedrock. The main exhibition hall was a climate-controlled vault, large enough to host 60 vehicles without crowding, accessible by heavy-duty hydraulic lifts. The lower level was the maintenance bay, equipped with full fabrication tools and a dedicated staff who lived off-site, rotating in shifts to maintain absolute operational security. Michael specified materials that could withstand extreme temperatures and electromagnetic pulse events. He insisted that every structural support beam used in the primary vault be reinforced with a specific alloy normally reserved for deep-sea oil rigs, suggesting he was preparing for threats far greater than local thieves or environmental collapse. The first vehicles arrived, shrouded in matte black wraps, transported in custom-built, hermetically sealed trailers. They were the cornerstones of the future collection. Not the flashiest, perhaps, but certainly the rarest and most historically resonant. There was a low-production European sports coupe whose engine notes sounded like tearing silk, and a brutish American prototype that never made it past the concept stage. Each car was a tangible piece of history, an object of desire that required immense influence and unlimited funds to acquire. Standing in the sterile, brightly lit vault, Michael finally allowed himself a small, private moment of satisfaction, fleeting and cold. The paperwork for the European coupe contained a hidden watermark showing the official seal of a recently disgraced oligarch, hinting at the ethically gray market Michael now commanded. These acquisitions were monuments to the fact that money was no longer an obstacle. It was merely a tool. He had achieved the pinnacle of financial independence, yet the silence in the vast desert space was louder than any ticker tape. He realized the collection wasn't just about replacing a phantom car. It was about building something irrefutable, something that could serve as a shield. When you control enough assets, you stop being a target and start being an economy unto yourself. But this financial immunity had a price. It meant finally having to face the debt owed to those who had engineered his rise. The cars were back. One of the maintenance technicians, hired through layers of anonymous vetting, was noticed performing a peculiar ritual. He meticulously checked the underside of every car for signs of surveillance even before they were unwrapped. The main residence itself, while massive and constructed of glass and steel that seemed to disappear into the landscape, was almost secondary. It was a place for transactions and strategy, not domesticity. The kitchen was designed for catering staff, the master suite for solitude. The real focus remained underground, where the humming machinery of the climate control systems whispered secrets of preservation. He had purchased perfection, demanding that every gasket, every tire, every drop of oil remain eternally pristine, defying the entropy of the external world. He was building his own perfect universe, sealed off from the corruption and interference of others. During the inspection of the communications room, Michael noticed that the secure server racks contained empty slots for equipment far more sophisticated than anything commercially available, implying future integration of military-grade systems. The joy of these physical milestones was perverse. They represented how far he had run, yet simultaneously how close he was to the starting line. The banking acquisition was already beginning to draw the attention he had expected and dreaded. Poking at the debt structure of a regional bank was like throwing a rock into a beehive belonging to his creators. They were watchers, engineers of influence, and they preferred their subjects to remain compliant, predictable, and, above all, invisible. Michael's sudden, spectacular visibility in the high-end collector market, masked though it was, felt like an overt challenge. A discreet, encrypted message arrived on his private satellite line. 3 innocuous words: "The house is built," a phrase that chilled him instantly, confirming that his movements had been logged and acknowledged by the very people he sought to evade. The sprawling estate, the gleaming cars, the fortified Garazit wasn't just a dream realized. It was a battle line drawn in the unforgiving desert sand, waiting for the first hostile engagement. The long silence broke, not with a whimper, but with a digitized cough. A security line buried 3 layers deep in Michael's communications hub, pinged the code he hadn't heard in 6 years, a relic from their old life, a digital ghost. The message wasn't signed, just a series of coordinate shifts and a timestamp, implying a demand to connect. He knew precisely who it was. They never used names. He could have ignored it, let the digital trail turn cold. But that 3-word confirmation from days before "the house is built" still stung, confirming their access to his deepest network layers. It meant they believed they held the superior position, the moral high ground, or perhaps simply the truth, and Michael knew he had to redefine the playing field. He decided to meet them. He didn't respond to their coordinates. Instead, he fired off a single, untraceable invitation, routing it through 5 different shell companies and landing it directly on the monitored frequency they always used: my place. Next Friday, 19 o'clock. Short, declarative. No room for negotiation. This wasn't a reunion. It was a site inspection. He watched the massive steel gate, recent $5 million addition built to withstand low-level artillery cycle, closed. He found himself polishing a specific vintage photograph on his desk, an image from a childhood he barely remembered, featuring 3 smiling faces that felt utterly alien now, a lingering emotional tether he fiercely tried to suppress. The estate was a fortress of his own making, yet suddenly it felt claustrophobic. Waiting for the invasion, Michael walked the perimeter, not checking the cameras, but the flower beds. He instructed the staff to leave the pool lights off, wanting the shadows to do the work. He wanted the house to look successful, yes, but also ominous. He was manipulating the setting, wanting the sheer, unbridled cost of his freedom to slap them across the face the moment they drove onto the winding, private road carved out of the mountain. He rehearsed the conversation in his head, the silent accusations, the practiced indifference. He noticed a small tremor in his hand while pouring a scotch, something he hadn't experienced since the chaotic early days of his exile. It was physical evidence that, despite the billions in assets and the armored glass, they still held the trigger to his nervous system. They were the architects of his initial programming, and that code ran deep. The memory of the last phone caller, cold, analytical dismissal of his life choices flashed through his mind, confirming his suspicion that they viewed him not as a son, but as a failed experiment that had escaped the laboratory and needed to be categorized. Friday arrived, bringing with it a dry, relentless Santa Ana wind that rattled the reinforced windows. Exactly at 19 o'clock, the main security monitor flashed red. They were ready. Not in a discreet sedan, but in a heavy, government-issued black SUV that looked suspiciously armored, driven by someone Michael didn't recognize, a professional security shadow, a silent nod to their continued institutional connection. The vehicle immediately escalated the meeting from a personal gathering to a tactical encounter. They didn't even park it correctly. leaving it angled aggressively near the marble fountain. Michael allowed himself a faint, dangerous smile. They were trying too hard to project power. He watched them exit the vehicle. His father, still wearing their ridiculously conservative suit that served as his camouflage in the halls of global influence, looked slightly smaller than Michael remembered. His mother, rigid and impeccably dressed, scanned the horizon. Taking in the scale of the debt Michael had accumulated, physical and metaphorical. She paused, running a manicured finger across the imported Italian stone of the walkway, a gesture of cold appraisal, not admiration. They were clearly calculating the exact cost of his defiance, item by item, assessing assets and liabilities rather than greeting a relative. Michael opened the massive mahogany door himself, choosing not to use the staff. He was wearing perfectly tailored silk leather wear, deliberately casual, conveying total control. The contrast with his father's starched collar was jarring. The air in the foyer, already cooled to an almost clinical temperature, crackled. There was no hug, no awkward handshake, just the deep, measuring silence of two opposing generals meeting on neutral ground that wasn't neutral at all. The intentional power play established a new hierarchy instantly. Michael, his father, stated, the word delivered with the flat intonation of reading a manifest. You've done well. The hesitation before well was deliberate, implying that while the structure was impressive, the asterisk method must have been fundamentally flawed, unsustainable, or morally compromised. That was the core of their expectation, that underneath the edifice they would find a familiar, weak Michael seeking validation or, better yet, money to cover an imminent collapse. His mother finally spoke, her voice smooth and dangerous, like polished steel. The view is expansive. I assume you secured the Northern Ridge access, or is that still open to the public? She wasn't commenting on the beauty. She was probing the security vulnerabilities, treating his home like a poorly designed intelligence asset, confirming a background. Michael offered them a drink, gesturing toward the bespoke bar that housed a bottle of pre-war Scotch worth more than their entire retirement fund. He poured 3 fingers of the expensive amber liquid for himself, leaving the bottle silent on the counter. It's secure. Everything is secure, Mother. You taught me the value of redundancy. Remember, he didn't pour them a drink. He waited for them to ask. This small, petty refusal shattered the polite facade immediately, reversing the expected familial hierarchy. They hadn't come here to drink or reminisce. They had come to confirm the damage and offer pity disguised as a rescue. They looked around the opulent room, their eyes searching for the telltale signs of desperation, a poorly hidden unpaid bill, a trembling hand, the ghost of fear in his eyes. What they found instead was a man perfectly at ease, too calm. He noticed his father's gaze lingering on the Rothko hanging in the corner, not because of the art, but because he knew the market cap of the piece had just ballooned, indicating Michael's financial liquidity was not a... The real shock wasn't the wealth, it was the isolation. Michael had built this monument entirely without their support, outside their control. And as they stepped further into the house, closer to the inner sanctum of his secured life, they began to realize the silent, terrifying truth. Michael hadn't invited them here for reconciliation. He had invited them here to see the distance he had achieved. The tension peaked when my mother finally broke the silence, her eyes starting toward the window overlooking the gravel drive. Michael, there, she started, the tone dripping with carefully constructed concern. That old Valiant parked out front. You haven't been forced to keep it running, have you? You know, for sentimental value. I assumed you'd have replaced that relic immediately. This was it, the final petty dig, the attempt to ground the spectacle in their familiar narrative of pity. I smiled, genuinely, and led them down a hallway they hadn't yet explored, toward a heavy, unmarked door reinforced with polished steel. Oh, Mother, I chuckled softly. pressing the biometric scanner. The Valiant is just a decoy. It teaches the delivery drivers where to park. The door hissed open, revealing not a utility room, but a vast expanse of polished epoxy flooring, illuminated by museum-grade LED strips. The air smelled of clean leather and high-octane fuel. This wasn't a garage. It was a cathedral of velocity. The temperature was regulated to preserve the carbon fiber and paint, parked in precise, immaculate rows were the ghosts of every dream they had ever dismissed. A Carrera GT, a bespoke Aston Martin, 2 Rolls Royces, and tucked away in the back, the fully restored, mint-condition classic I bought purely because they once told me I'd never afford anything but used compacts. They didn't just see cars, they saw billions in liquid assets preserved under glass. My father, a man whose entire life was predicated on controlling the room, stood rigid. His jaw was slack. My mother reached out, not toward a car, but toward the wall, as if needing support. The stunned silence was absolute, a void swallowing the grand pronouncements and condescending pity they had brought with them. I let the silence hang, heavy and satisfying, for what felt like an hour. "That," I finally whispered, my voice echoing slightly off the high ceiling, "is the redundancy I was taught to value. Not just cars, but options, choices, the ability to never, ever need to listen to that tone again." They stood defeated, not by my anger, but by my indifference. The reward was the peace of this moment, watching the foundation of their authority crumbled before the sheer, unassailable weight of my success. The cost, it was everything. I had traded family ties, affection, and obligation for this perfect, fortified solitude. But standing here, watching the ultimate payoff, I realized the transaction was fundamentally sound. Betrayal, when executed perfectly, is merely the highest form of self-preservation. I closed the steel door gently behind us, locking away the noise of the world and the ghosts of their expectations. The silence followed us back into the house, a heavy velvet shroud. I understood then that freedom isn't the absence of chains. It is the construction of a fortress so complete the chains can't even touch the walls. Thank you for listening to this chapter. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to build your own fortress, please hit the like button. Subscribe for more tales of calculated victory, and tell me in the comments, what price did you pay for your independence?